John.
Hey, Sean, there's a report this morning that you reached out directly to the CIA Director Pompeo. Did you directly contact Director Pompeo and ask him to knock down the New York Times story on the Russia connection?
Thanks, John. Let me, kind of, if I may, walk through the entire timeline. I think it's important. As I mentioned, I think a week ago, the New York Times published a story about what they called contacts between members of the Trump campaign and Russian officials. The FBI deputy director was at a meeting here at the White House that morning. After the meeting concluded, he asked the chief of staff to stand back a second. He wanted to tell him that the report in the New York Times was, quote, BS. For viewers at home, I think you can pretty much figure what that means, but I'll leave it at that. At that time, the chief of staff said, thank you for sharing that with me. Can we let other people know that the story is not accurate? Throughout the day, they went back and forth to see what they thought was appropriate. Finally came to the conclusion that they did not want to get in the process of knocking down every story that they had issues with. We then were informed that other people had come to the same conclusions, including that time Chairman Devin Nunes had told us, hey, I've been knocking this down, telling reporters. We shared a number with him of a reporter that had contacted us. And again, when the reporters contacted us and we said, no, that's not, to the best of our knowledge, it's not true, they were asking us, can you point to anybody else that can substantiate this? And I think we did a good job of saying, sure, we will share with reporters other people who have come to the same conclusion. So I won't go into the specifics. I will say that I think we did our job very effectively by making sure that reporters who had questions about the accuracy and the claims made in the New York Times, that we were pointing them to subject matter experts who understood whether or not that story was accurate or not. And I think just to continue to be very, very clear on this, it was about the accuracy of the reporting and the claims that were made in there, plain and simple, about whether or not a story that appeared in the New York Times was accurate. And individual after individual continued to say that they, as far as they knew, they weren't. I think most of you probably saw Chairman Nunes' comments this morning. He was very clear, number one, that he reached out to us to say, I've been telling people, reporters, that these allegations and descriptions in the New York Times are not accurate. And then we shared that information with him, but he came to us to share that he equally had that issue brought up to him. He was briefed and saw, quote, no evidence that the story was accurate. So the answer is, we have continued to give reporters information and sources that went to the accuracy or lack thereof of a report that was in a newspaper. And I think, I think Chairman Nunes also equally said it's interesting how we literally were engaging with the press, saying, if you have a question about the sourcing on this, obviously when brought to our attention, we said it's not accurate as far as we know. But then most of you and your colleagues who had inquired would say, well, that's great, I'm sure you're saying this, but who else can corroborate this? So our job was to continue to, when informed, share sources who had equally come to the same conclusion that the Times story was not accurate.
You don't think there's something strange about, or there's something odd about the White House press secretary getting the CIA director on the phone to knock down a story about an investigation?
No, but see, respectfully, you're using words like knock down. There was a story in a newspaper. Hold on. No. It was. There was reporters coming to us saying there is a story out there. What's your take on it? And our answer was, we don't believe it's accurate. We don't believe it's false. But obviously, that's our take on it. And reporters were saying to us, well, is there anybody that you can point to substantiate this claim? Now, remember, this all started with the FBI coming to us, bringing it to our attention, saying that the story in the Times was not accurate. In fact, it was BS. And all we did was simply say, that's great. Could you tell other reporters the same thing you're telling us? And I would think that other reporters, yourself included, would think that that would be a helpful thing to get the story straight. All we sought to do was to actually get an accurate report out. And again, I think Chairman Nunes this morning, over and over and over and over again, made it very clear that no evidence that has been brought to his attention suggests that reporting was accurate. So, respectfully, I think it's interesting that I'm being asked what's appropriate when what we're doing is actually urging reporters to engage with subject matter experts who can corroborate whether or not something's accurate or not.
Should there be a special prosecutor? Darrell Issa has called for a special prosecutor to look into this.
Right, and I guess my question would be, a special prosecutor for what?
Look into the whole Russia connection.
But
the whole
yeah,
Russia
and
influence
here's
in the
my
campaign.
right, and I guess
he
my
was part of the campaign. Sessions was part of the campaign.
I
Attorney
understand,
General.
but here's my question, Jonathan. We have now for 6 months heard story after story come out about unnamed sources say the same thing over and over again, and nothing's come of it. Right? We've heard the same people, the same anecdotes, and we've heard reports over and over again. And as Chairman Nunes made very clear today, he has seen nothing that corroborates that. So at what point you've got to ask yourself, what are you investigating?
Well, Russian interference. Beyond
no,
the
and
context.
I think that both the House and the Senate have looked at it. You know as well as I do that the intelligence community has looked at it as well. There's a big difference. I think that Russia's involvement and activity has been investigated up and down. So the question becomes at some point, if there's nothing to further investigate, what are you asking people to investigate? I mean, Chairman Nunes spoke very clearly today when asked over and over and over again about all of this and said that he has seen nothing that leads him to believe that there's there. The president has spoken forcefully time and time again that he has no interest in Russia. He hasn't talked to people in Russia in years. And yet you keep asking, and I say you collectively, to try to find something that seemingly at least the reporting that I'm seeing in different organizations suggests that there's nothing new that's being reported. It's the same stuff over and over again that we've heard for literally 6 months. And so the question becomes at some point, what do you need to further investigate if there is nothing that has come out?
Well,
And
do you not categorically deny there were no contacts between the Russians
oh,
and
I
anybody
can't
on the
deny. I
campaign?
can't. I guess my question is,
That's
I'm not right.
That's what the investigation would look at.
Right, and I guess my point is that you've had the intelligence community look at Russia's involvement in the election. You've had the House and the Senate both do the same. And so what I'm trying to ascertain is at what point, how many people have to say that there's nothing there before you realize there's nothing there? I can't say unequivocally. All I'm saying is the people who've done the investigating about Russia overall and its activities in the United States, specifically now with respect to our election, haven't provided anything that lead me to believe or should leave you to believe. And I continue to see reports coming from different media sources that are saying, when they checked in with law enforcement or intelligence community sources, there's nothing more than has been previously reported over and over again. So at some point, you do have to ask yourself, what are you actually looking for? How many times do you have to come to the same conclusion before you take the answer? And that's what Mara?
Sean,
Just to be clear, just to follow up on that,
Yeah.
did you personally reach out to Pompeo?
I'm not going to
Why-
discuss what we did internally. I'm just going to say that when we shared, we did our job about making sure that when reporters had questions, we let them know what subject matter experts were available to discuss the accuracy of a newspaper story. Mara.
Yeah, I'm sure people will come back to this, but I actually have a budget question, which is, during the campaign, the president said he was not going to touch Medicare, Social Security. His Treasury Secretary repeated that. It sounded like the OMB director was leaving that as an open question to
No, no, no.
TBD. I'm just wondering, what's the state of the promise? That
Right.
he won't touch it for current retirees,
No,
anybody
I
paying
think
in?
what the
Yeah.
OMB director made clear is how it works. The budget is dealing with the top line discretionary numbers. Policy decisions are not part of the budget. That was what he was being asked and what he. So I just want to be clear in terms of what he was. And
The
again, I
state
think
of the promise.
right,
In
and
other
I think the
words,
state
what
of the
is the
promise,
promise? Yeah.
is clear. And I think, as you point out, he had made the promise. He stands by the promise. The
But
Treasury
what is the
Secretary.
promise? Current retirees, people near retirement, anybody paying into
I
these
will follow
programs?
up specifically on that before I get, but I think the president has made very clear that that's not his intent to do. He wants to focus on the discretionary side. That entitlement reform is not that with respect to those programs that he mentioned. He stands by his word.
Sean, the
Fred
president
Lucas.
has,
Fred.
wanted to ask a couple of issues. An executive order on religious freedom had previously been in the works. Will that still come? And if it does, will it extend beyond religious freedom? And,
Well, I'm sorry, Fred. What?
I'm sorry. Will it extend beyond the Johnson Amendment?
I think we've discussed executive orders in the past, and for the most part, we're not going to get into discussing what may or may not come until we're ready to announce it. So I'm sure as we move forward, we'll have some. Olivier.
Thanks, Sean.
I'm sorry. I just one more.
Okay.
The issue of tax reform. And will there be, how committed is the administration to a border-adjusted tax? And is there any concern that there won't be enough conservative support for that, but it could block any meaningful tax reform long term?
Well, I'm not going to get into the specifics of tax reform today. The president's made clear that we'll have an outline of a plan very soon. But what I will say is that I think he has talked about the concerns that he has with current regulatory and tax policy that benefit people from moving out of the country and shipping products back in while shedding American workers. He will continue to fight for policies that promote manufacturing and job creation in the United States and supports American workers. So I don't want to get ahead of the exact nature of the policy. He has been seeking a lot of input. As I mentioned earlier, he's going to talk today with Speaker Ryan and Senator McConnell. I know that both the joint session, the status of repeal and replace, and I'm sure some discussion of tax reform will probably come up. But there's a lot. We're continuing to move forward and work with them. Olivier.
Thanks. A couple on the ISIS strategy.
Yeah.
Can you just get to the timetable from now that you've received it, what happens? And there's a report that you're asking for $30 billion in emergency defense spending on top of the 54 in the budget. Is that true? Does that cover the new ISIS strategy? Can you explain the relationship between the two?
Thank you. Right now, literally that principals meeting that I mentioned at the beginning is happening as we speak. So Secretary Mattis was coming over to brief the principals as far as the ISIS plan. And again, part of it was to make sure that he fully discusses the recommendations that he's making and seek the input and feedback of the other principals downstairs. That can help guide where we go from here, how we go. With respect to the funding, I think Director Mulvaney noted that there'll be a supplemental at some point. Right now, the focus is on the budget, and then we'll go from there. John Gizzi.
Thank you, Sean. Two brief questions. First, I read your statement at the Thursday briefing to Governor Malloy of Connecticut during the NGA meeting, and he responded, and I quote, Sean didn't read a thing that I said. He said that in Connecticut, they are already working to get criminals who are in the country illegally out. His objection was to going into warming centers or schools where officials might frighten children. Your response to the governor on that?
Well, again, I was asked specifically what the comments were with respect to sanctuary cities, and again, I would reiterate, with all due respect to the governor, I'm not here to pick a fight with the governor. I enjoyed my time going to school in the state of Connecticut, but I have a kind affection of the Nutmeg State. But the reality is, I think that there's a difference. Whether or not what he wants to do with state funds, maybe, without knowing the exact nature of how he's funding, what he's funding, it's difficult. The question I was asked at the time was on how we would be handling it. And I think the answer, whether it's Connecticut or California, is that the president's executive order and the president's commitment is to make sure that tax dollars are not used to support programs that are helping people who are not in the country legally and who are not citizens entitled to them.
Blake, one more question,
Okay.
Sean.
Starting early.
For 58 years, when presidents have gone to Rome,
Yeah.
they've always met the Pope, going back to when President Eisenhower met Pope John the 23rd. Now, 1 year ago this week, candidate Trump had a disagreement with this Pope in an exchange of words. When he goes to Rome in May for his first European trip, will he meet with this Pope?
It's a great question. Obviously, I would be a huge fan of that. But I'm not going to. I don't think we're at that place in the planning process to make an announcement on any visits with the Pope. But Blake.
Sean, thank you. Two budget questions, if you don't mind. Mr. Mulvaney, I believe, just said that what the administration plans on putting forward doesn't add to the current deficit projection, which the CBO says is about $560 billion. But he didn't say that it would significantly drop from that either. So my first question is the administration comfortable putting something forward that might rack up deficits of potentially hundreds of billions of dollars?
Well, I think I'm trying to understand the question a little, if you can help me with this, because
he said it wasn't going to add to it.
Right.
So my question is, he didn't necessarily say it was going to cut from it either. If it doesn't cut from it, potentially it could be hundreds of billions in deficits, and I'm curious.
Right, no, but I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, he basically made it very clear it doesn't add to the projected baseline deficit, right? So that continues to be the goal, and I think as we continue to work through this process of passback, it can work both ways. We could identify further savings and reductions through working with the agencies and departments. But we're going to make sure that the top line number we maintain and as close to that as possible. And as we go through this, I mean, this is the beginning of the process, as the director noted. We send the number to the department of the agency, give them some ideas how we came up with this, and then they come back to us and either justify why the particular program or office or what have you needs to stay in existence, or why maybe not the reduction that is offered. But it's a back and forth process that will occur over the next few weeks. So
Let me ask you
to
about-
get ahead of it is the problem.
Let me ask you what Nancy Pelosi, to just get a quick reaction to Nancy Pelosi. She put out a statement and said the following, quote, 5 weeks into his administration, President Trump has not introduced a single jobs bill. Your reaction to that would be what?
He's created a lot of jobs. I think that's he's continuing to work with Congress on both repealing and replacing Obamacare, tax reform, and fundamentally, both of those two items alone, I think, can help spur a lot of economic growth. The meetings that we've had with the CEOs, the health insurers, there's so many things that are both job killing and that can be done to help promote a better regulatory and tax climate that lead to job creation. I think that's one of the biggest problems right now, is that people in Washington aren't necessarily talking to job creators and saying, what is the impediment that you have to hiring more American workers? What are the impediment that you have to manufacturing more, to building here? The meetings and the actions that the president has taken on both regulatory and other matters have helped spur job and job creation. You've heard these companies come in over and over again, the automakers, the airlines, Sprint. I mean, the list goes on and on and on of people saying to the president, because of your agenda, because of your vision, we're willing to commit to hiring additional people, to manufacturing more. You know, that's how jobs are created. It's not through the government. And too often, it's the government regulations that stifle and prevent job creation. And I think the president, as a businessman, fully appreciates and understands how this works and what some of those impediments do to creating jobs and to growing the economy. And so I would just say that you haven't seen anything yet. It's going to continue to be the case. Trey.
Thanks, Sean. Is there concern in the administration that a large-scale military buildup will appear threatening to other countries around the world and lead to some sort of arms race with other countries?
No, I think when you look at the state of some of the infrastructure in our military, with the age of our ships or our planes, or some of the other hardware that exists, you recognize that we need to rebuild a lot of these things. The size of our Navy has gone down significantly, and there are new needs and new planning. And when you look at the commitment that you have to make, not just in 1 year, but in several years, for a lot of these programs, ships and tanks, even weapon systems, they don't get built in a month or a day. You have to make a commitment early on to make the investment because of the time that it takes to procure them, to build them, the research and development that goes into it. And so I would just suggest to you that this is the first step in making sure we make the commitment to a military that, especially through the sequester the last few years, has not gotten the funding it needs to get off life support. There are a lot of things that are being taken care of in the military where they're just continuing to, they're not putting the systems and the projects in place to allow the military to keep up with the times, and that's a problem, major.
Sean, one investigation question, one budget question. As you may be aware, Bill Owens, followed Ryan Owens, gave an interview with Miami Herald over the weekend, and he said, quote, "The government owes my son an investigation. On behalf of the President of the United States, is the President open to an investigation of the raid in Yemen?" And the father of Ryan Owens called that a stupid mission. Is there something that you'd like to communicate to him about that mission that might persuade him otherwise?
Yeah, thank you. That's multi-part, so let me kind of walk through it slowly. First of all, I can't possibly imagine what he's going through in terms of the loss of a son. I can tell him that on behalf of the president, his son died a hero, and the information that he was able to help obtain through that raid, as I've said before, was going to save American lives. It's going to protect our country more. So he made a sacrifice to this country. He was on his 12th deployment. And I know that his wife, when she spoke to the president, knows that he did this because he loved it. He cared about our nation. And the mission was successful in helping prevent a future attack or attacks on this nation. It obtained a lot of information that will help us keep safe. With respect to his request, it is standard operating procedure for the Department of Defense to undergo what they call a 15-6 review. That review, in this case, is three-pronged. Because there was a fatality and the loss of life, there's that. because there was civilians involved. That's another. And then third is because there was hardware, a helicopter that was damaged. That is a separate. So in fact, there will be 3 reviews done by the Department of Defense because of the nature of this. But again, I can't stress enough that on behalf of the President, on behalf of this nation, we express our condolences, extend our prayers to him during this time. And
As you said, that is standard procedure. Is there anything the President is particularly curious about with this mission, in that it was brought to him, he authorized it quickly? Does he believe in the main it was carried out well, and there's nothing that he's particularly curious about in the way either the helicopter was damaged, the fatality, the civilian casualties, of anything of the like?
well, number one, I've walked through the timetable previously in terms of how long this had been planned for, dating well back into the previous administration. And as you know, their recommendation at the time was to wait for a moonless night. That night wasn't going to occur during President Obama's administration. And so when General Mattis got into the Department of Defense, he was briefed up on the status of the thing, made aware of when the next time was go. We went through the process to ensure that we continued to believe that the mission, the way it was going to be conducted, and the results of the mission would be worthy of action. The conclusion continued to be, as it was prior, that we should move forward. As I mentioned before, I think you can't ever say that when there's, most importantly, loss of life and people injured, that it's 100% successful. But I think when you look at what the stated goal of that mission was, it was an information and intelligence gathering mission, and it achieved that its objectives. So, again, I would express our thoughts and our prayers and our condolences to all of the people in Chief Owens, his family and his friends, his shipmates. But it's something that, as a SEAL and as someone who deployed 12 times, he knew that this was part of the job, and he knew what he was doing, and so we're very comfortable with how the mission was executed, and you know, we'll let the Department of Defense go through that review process and then see where that leads us. But I think to get ahead of the 3 separate reviews are being done by the Department of Defense would be probably a little irresponsible at this time.
Sean, on
Quickly on the
regulations.
budget.
Major gets two, too.
It's just real quick on the budget. As you are aware, to undo the defense sequester,
Yeah.
you have to get 60 votes in the Senate because you have a separate domestic sequester number and defense. Are you confident with these numbers and with this kind of heavy discretionary spending cut proposed, you can get the 60 votes to change the law? Because without that change in law, the proposal is just that. It doesn't become operational.
I think that when it comes to our nation's security, specifically our nation's military, I don't think that it's a partisan issue. I think that senators from across the country, whether you're talking about Florida or what kind of, whether you've got an Army installation or a Navy base, you understand the state of repair that many of our planes, ships, and other hardware is in. And I think that there is a bipartisan commitment to give the military and its members the equipment and the tools it needs to succeed and protect this country. So I do feel confident. April?
Sean, I'm sorry. Sean,
Yeah.
I have a couple of budgetary questions for you. One, at the press conference, President Trump talked about the fix for inner cities. What is the investment in this budget when it comes to a fix for inner cities?
It's a good try. I think the director was
That's
very clear that we're
wonderful.
not, I mean, part of the process today was to start that pass-back process that he talked about, where we're going to the various departments, whether it's HUD or DOT, and giving them that top-line number and then hearing back. So I don't want to get into a specific number with you before we get too far down the process. I think that's a conversation that we're going to have with the agencies, and then we will have subsequently with Congress when they start drafting their
Okay,
resolution.
follow up on this, but I do have a question. But see, he talked about healthcare. He talked about education.